Welcome to another episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. Today, we are going to look at something different, the way history is portrayed in movies, especially, and also a little bit on television. Does it enhance? Does it engage? Does it distract or even misinform? And so we have an expert joining us to look at history versus Hollywood and examine how the portrayal of history can impact our understanding and enjoyment. Sit back, grab some popcorn, and enjoy. I am here with a new friend of mine, J Trow, who has taken on a project that is fascinating to me and I know a lot of other people because I've chatted with you about it. The idea of Hollywood versus history, the way that some historical events are memorialized in not so much a documentary, but a movie or a made for TV kind of movie. So, J Trow, welcome to Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you, Caroline. It's nice of you to invite me.
Well, let me ask you. Well, I'm so happy you said yes. I'm just so excited about this. What inspired you to write this book? I know you've written a lot of other books. What inspired you to take up this project?
I think really I became an historian because of the cinema, because as a kid, back in the 1950s, I used to go to the pictures, as we say in the UK, regularly, and anything historical, cowboys and Indians, knights in armor, the blood and guts of history, I loved. And then eventually I realized maybe it wasn't quite like that. And I wanted to know more. I wanted to know what it was really like. And so I went into history properly, went to university, read the subject there, and it just grew from that. You mentioned other books that I've written. Thank you for that. Yes, I have. But all of them, every single one, has an historical element to it. Even crime fiction, there's got to be some history in there somewhere.
Right. So your love of history comes through, and it is really interesting to see that the love of history started with that cinema view, with the pictures and seeing the history sort of played out and then wondering what really happened. So that's a great question. So I just want to dive in to a few of the movies you talk about, a few of the things you talk about, and I'm going to start with Braveheart. Because interestingly enough, as I was preparing for our conversation, I was also watching something where it was Dr. Helen Carr was talking about the time of Braveheart, right? That whole Hammer of the Scots and the wars with England and Scotland. And she mentioned Braveheart. And I thought, okay,
Yeah.
I need to follow up on this.
Okay.
So you include in your book that although it's a great movie, it's really compelling and well told, it does include some 20th century ideas that weren't really part of the history. And I know that Randall Wallace was asked those questions and he said, and I think this is interesting, he said, quote, "I will tell you of William Wallace. Historians from England will say I'm a liar." So do you think that it's the English versus Scottish perspective, or is there some historic, because it's not intended to be a documentary and that's
No.
different. So tell us a little, because you thought that, a completely historically accurate view of that time period would end up feeling like a documentary.
Mhm.
So tell us a little bit about that. And thinking about Braveheart, because we've all seen, Mel Gibson and the blue paint and all of that. It's such an image.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, let me say first of all that Randall Wallace, who wrote the screenplay, isn't a liar. Of course, he's just chosen to make William Wallace a hero. And the point about Hollywood movies, any movie, is that you have to have a hero. You have to have a good guy. You have to have a villain. It would be nice if you had some love interest, because without that, you're going to lose some of your audience. And so Braveheart has all that. William Wallace is the hero. He's the good guy. Patrick McGowan, the King of England, Edward the First, is the bad guy. We even have William Wallace having an affair, which is completely unhistorical, with the Queen of England.
Mhm.
Um, so it ticks all the boxes for a Hollywood movie, and that's why it could never work as a documentary, because it twists the facts more than somewhat. Yeah, the blue and white war paint with Gibson covered in that is totally unhistoric. There is nothing about that in history. Even kilts, in fact, we've got Wallace and Co. charging the fields of Bannockburn with their kilts. They didn't wear kilts in the Middle Ages. Kilts is 18th century, really, but it's all part of the tradition. It's how we regard Scotland. We expect Scots to be wearing kilts, so they feature in Braveheart. There is one scene in Braveheart, which I love, where Edward the First, Patrick McGowan, who doesn't approve of his son's relationships with young men, grabs one of these young men and throws him off a castle tower. Great cinema, terrible history. It never happened. We have William Wallace dying at the same time as Edward the First. Didn't happen. Edward the First died 2 years later than William Wallace. But you've got to cheat. If you want a rattling good yarn, which Braveheart is, then you got to make it work. You've got to simplify the story. You've got to have a goodie and a baddie, and then audiences will lap it up. And Braveheart was terrific. I remember seeing it in the cinema and thinking, wow, the epics are back, which is wonderful, because the real epic period is the 1960s, when I was a teenager. And I miss those years, I miss those great films. And Braveheart
Right.
was a return to that kind of movie.
Yes, it is an epic movie, and that is a really good point, and audiences did lap it up. Audience really enjoyed that, and that is part of it. Okay, that's a really good point. I enjoy that. Now, to move forward in time just a little bit to a time period that I'm actually working on a program right now on Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots. So
Mhm.
there have been 2 very famous movies named Mary Queen of Scots, an older
Mhm.
one in 1971, which I just loved that version, and newer one in 2019. So the story
Uh-huh.
is still thought to be compelling with some of the hottest actresses right now. Both versions of those movies have an in-person meeting between Mary and Elizabeth, which is great cinema, as you say, but historically did not happen. So why do you I just think it's so fascinating. They're not the same movie. It's not a remake. It's a different telling, but in both movies they have this meeting in person. Why do you think that's so irresistible for filmmakers to have these 2 women meet in person?
I think it adds to the drama of the whole thing. There's actually no reason why Elizabeth and Mary shouldn't have met. Mary was imprisoned for most of her adult life in Fotheringay Castle, which is something like 2 hours horse ride from London, which is where Elizabeth spent most of her time. So they could easily have met in that woodland glade in the 1971 version.
Mhm.
But they didn't, and they didn't because Elizabeth couldn't really trust herself. I think Elizabeth is much more of an emotional character than we perhaps realize.
Mhm.
This woman was, after all, her cousin. They were related by blood, and she didn't want to appear too soft. And so she kept herself at arm's length. She never went to see Mary at all, and Mary wasn't allowed to go and see Elizabeth. But from the point of view of historical drama, to have 2 enemies face to face, and if you remember in the 71 version, Elizabeth loses her cool, Glenda
Mhm.
Jackson lashes out with her horsewhip and hits Vanessa Redgrave, and we're all going, oh, sitting in our seats, squirming around, wondering what's going to happen. That makes for a good historical movie.
Right, and we really feel like that helps us know the characters, right? Because you see them together, they bring out each other's vulnerabilities, right? They sort of push each other's buttons, and that's part of how we get to know these characters. All
Yeah,
right.
that's exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to move on, and I am sort of sticking with the British history because that's what we talk about on this podcast. So we're not going to get into the westerns you mentioned quite as much, although you can bring those in. But there's another time period and another movie that you mentioned, and in fact, you say, I believe you think it's one of the best medieval films, and that is the original, because this one did get a remake, but let's talk about the original Lion in Winter, because that is
Mhm.
such a classic. And of course, it was made in 1968 with Timothy Dalton. I mean, the stars in that movie really is extraordinary, right? So you've got Timothy Dalton, Anthony Hopkins, Peter O'Toole. So you have this amazing cast, and Katharine Hepburn, who, steals every scene, playing, interestingly enough, this very French queen who became Queen of England, which Katharine Hepburn is neither English nor French, but anyway, still manages to steal every scene, playing Eleanor of Aquitaine. So that is a movie that crackles with energy and tension and enthusiasm, and it's just great. So can you just tell us a little bit about how that movie gets it so right as a movie, and then mention a little bit of because it does do some things historically that are correct. Henry II did allow Eleanor to come to some Christmas courts. So there is a little bit of attention to historic detail, and then there's not. So tell us about that movie that is so great.
Okay. Sure. The story is set in 1183, and as you say, it's a Christmas court at the castle of Chinon in France. We have to remember that France wasn't the big state she is today. It was much smaller, and half of it was owned by the King of England. So it was a very complicated political setup. And Henry has kept his wife in prison for years because they hate each other and she's tried to kill him. But he feels a bit awkward. It's Christmas. Hey, let's have a family reunion. And so he invites her, gets her out of prison, and his boys are there. And his boys, that's Richard, who became Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey, who was killed eventually in a tournament, John, who became King John, who, by the way, is the least popular king in English history. They were a horrible trio, these three. That it was not much fun to be the parents of these kids, but there you go. And they also invited, just for laughs, the King of France, Philip. Now, Philip was, according to some people, having a homosexual relationship with Richard, became
Mhm.
Richard the Lionheart. We don't know if that's true. In fact, I probably think it's not, but that nevertheless is the rumor. So we have these tensions in existence all the time. Everybody hates everybody else. But for the sake of Christmas, they hang together. And it all goes horribly wrong. They end up literally at daggers drawn, trying to kill each other. And then eventually things are calmed down, and Henry sends Catherine back into, sends Eleanor back into prison again for the rest of her life, basically. So it becomes a family soap. It's a little saga, like Little House on the Prairie, set in medieval France. But it's such fun. And my favorite line is Catherine Hepburn's. Here they are, they're all trying to kill each other. And she says, what family doesn't have its ups and downs? That's just
It,
great.
it is great, and her delivery, I mean, you
I
really
see.
do, you believe that she's Eleanor of Aquitaine. I mean, she is
Yeah,
just
you do.
so great.
Yeah,
And
yep,
the scene where she sails into the castle and then later she sails away, it's just so beautiful cinematically, right? It's just
yes.
this spectacular um arrival and departure, and then in between it's just chaos, and everything's, as you say, everybody's fighting with everybody and they hate each other, but it really is just so good. And I think, although it didn't really happen that way, sort of showing the family, I mean, in addition to being the king and the queen and they are estranged and there are these children who were pretty competitive for the throne, to really show them off off the royal stage, right? We get to see them as a family inside the castle is pretty fun and pretty appealing to people, I think.
Yes, very, very much so. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, and you've got you're right. The appearance of the Queen on that barge is absolutely gorgeous. The filming, the cinematography is just to die for. Absolutely wonderful, and you really get a sense of how scruffy and dirty and horrible the Middle Ages were. And the king puts on his cloak and he's traipsing through mud just to get to his horse. It's that kind of thing. Lovely touches. Yeah.
Yes, it really does have wonderful touches. And then because it's Christmas, and this is a little anachronism, but it is fun because there's a Christmas
Yeah.
tree, which of course there wasn't, but they're wrapping up
Sure.
gifts in these funny way. Anyway, it really is so entertaining and so engaging. And it gives you such a sense of, I think, Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine and their love-hate relationship. They kind of can't leave each other alone, but can't leave with him, can't live without him kind of thing.
That's right.
And he
Yeah.
did sometimes let her out because she was a powerful figure who could do
Sure.
him some good. So there's a little bit of that
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just great, and those characters really come to life. I mean, we
That's
really
right.
see
I mean,
them.
she was such a feisty woman. I mean, she did go on crusade with her
Mhm.
first husband and literally was not perhaps fighting hand to hand, but she was certainly on battlefields at a
Right.
time when women were traditionally kept away from all that, where they essentially hid in castles and behaved themselves. Eleanor
Right.
didn't do
Mm,
that.
she didn't, and you really see that played out. So I
Yeah.
think they do capture some things really well, and I have to admit that Katharine Hepburn and Eleanor of Aquitaine, for a long time after I saw that movie, were the same person in my head because it seemed
Yeah.
like exactly how she would behave. So, yes, that was great. So let's turn to, I mean, I think Eleanor of Aquitaine is one of those people who's in some ways larger than life. She has all these legends around her, and Katharine Hepburn really got it right for me at least. Let's turn to another historic character larger than life, and that's Henry VIII. And a number of different people in different ways have portrayed Henry VIII. And it seems to me that he is one character who's famous enough, a lot of people have heard of him. Those Holbein portraits are famous enough. A lot of people think they know what he looks like, but his portrayals really run the gamut of different personalities and different ways of being larger than life. So can you just tell us about a few different ways? And I have to mention TV too, because I think the Tudors is an important part as well as movies here. But talk to us about Henry VIII as a character.
As a character, he should never have been king, of course. He was the second son of his father,
Yeah.
and the eldest boy, Arthur, died, so that left Henry as the king. He was intelligent, he was intellectual, he spoke umpteen languages, he was a champion jouster and wrestler. So he had it all. He was a Renaissance prince, steeped in all kinds of academic successes, as well as being hard and tough, which a king had to be in those days. And I don't know if your audience appreciates that although there was Parliament in Henry's day, as you would say, Congress, it had very few powers, and the king called the shots. The king decided what was going to happen. He decided, especially foreign policy. So he was vitally important. If the king is strong, the country does well. If the king is weak, the country has problems. And Henry became obsessed, of course, with what came to be known as the King's Great Matter. He wanted to carry on the Tudor dynasty. That was absolutely vital. Bearing in mind his father, Henry VII, had only got the throne by what I think is sheer luck. He won a battle
Hmm.
against Richard III. Bosworth, and therefore he effectively had stolen the throne. He usurped it. Henry VIII knew that perfectly well, so he has to make the reign strong. He has to keep the Tudor line going, which is fine, except that his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, produced a daughter. Now, forgive me, Caroline, but in the 16th century, women don't count. Okay.
Yeah.
A queen, a queen would be okay, but a king, that's what you really want. And Henry knows that. He knows that his nobility are not going to listen to what a queen tells them. They must have a man on the throne. So he goes to great lengths to get rid of Catherine of Aragon, find a new queen, Anne Boleyn, and produce a boy. And as I'm sure all your listeners will know, it all went horribly wrong, simply because when the marriage took place, which was only semi-legal in the eyes of the Catholic Church, that upset the Pope. The Pope excommunicated Henry. He was kicked out of the church. The whole country was kicked out of the church for several years. And then what does Anne Boleyn do? She produces another girl. Now, I know she went on to become Elizabeth I, and we've already talked about her, but at the time, no one knew that. So the whole divorce thing was a big mess and seemed like a big mistake. And we encapsulate all that complex man with his complex background, with his obsessions, into one huge guy in the Hans Holbein portrait with the padded shoulders and the stomach and the codpiece. We have suits of armor belonging to Henry still in the Tower of London. And when he was a prince, slim and young, 19 years old, then his waist measurement from the armor we've got is 31 inches. By the time he was middle-aged, in his 40s, it's ballooned to 54 inches. So he really packed on the weight. And that's what upset me about the Tudors television series,
Right.
because Rhys Myers stayed skinny the whole time. He didn't show any signs of putting on weight at all. And I thought that was wrong, because we have such an image of Henry that
Yes.
he really ought to have been a little bit padded.
Yes, because we know historically that was true. He did get bigger and bigger. And there were reasons for that, including his injuries and his leg injury. And there were consequences of that because he couldn't get
Sure.
around and he got angrier and it mattered. It
Yeah.
wasn't just someone putting on some weight. It really
No, no,
mattered
no.
in the reign. So
That's exactly right. Yep.
so you mentioned Jonathan Rhys Myers as one who, because he wouldn't, and I read, I don't know how true it is, but I read he didn't want a padded suit.
Yeah.
He wanted to stay slim, which doesn't work
Sure.
for Henry. But what about some of the other portrayals that you've seen? Because there have been some large Henrys. Um,
Mm.
so what portrayals of Henry worked differently or worked better or worse for you?
That's a tricky one. I think probably my favorite Henry is actually Robert Shaw. In A Man for All Seasons.
Yeah.
He's auburn, which is the right color. He's big. He's a big guy anyway, Robert Shaw. He
Yes.
looks the part. He hasn't yet got fat, as Henry became in later life. He's got a marvelous twinkle, has Robert Shaw. And I think the real Henry must have had as well. He must have been charming to be able to have so many people do his bidding. Okay, they were afraid of him too. You know, the king had literally the power of life and death over everybody. So there was that element to it. And Shaw has that hidden steel, that inner
Mm-hmm.
quality. He's smiling, but he's saying basically, cross me if you dare. And I think that comes across in Man for All Seasons extremely
Yes.
well.
One of my favorite scenes in Man for All Seasons with Henry himself is when they've pulled the boat and he's visiting Thomas More. So it's already going to be tense. They've pulled the boat in and he jumps off the barge, the royal barge, and he hits the water in the mud. And everyone is horrified and terrified. And then he bursts out laughing. And then everybody laughs. And you can imagine living on a knife's edge. I think that just perfectly. And I agree, Robert Shaw was brilliant because you never knew if he was going to explode in anger or explode in laughter. And either was possible all the time. And that seems
Yeah,
to me to be really
exactly.
true of Henry. I mean, I thought he got that.
Very much so. Yeah, yeah. And of course, if you remember in that scene, once the king has done it, all the others have to do it too, because hey, that's
Yes.
how it works, you
That
know?
yes, so they all went in with muddy
Yeah.
hose. But you're right.
They
You
are,
do
yeah.
you do what the king does. but
Uh,
it just was on a knife's edge all the time. So I
yeah,
thought that was really good. It's not the biggest role for Henry VIII because there's so much about more in that movie, but
sure.
it
Yes.
is great. It is really great. I
Mhm.
also I'm going to ask you what you think of this. I also really like the Six Wives of Henry VIII with Keith Michelle. I thought he also evolved. So you see him young and more slender and more athletic and having fun with Catherine of Aragon early on, which I really like because they show when they were first married and things were going well between them. And by the end, he is huge and can barely walk. And so I like that evolution. You really do see the king change in that one. All
Yeah,
right.
I agree. Absolutely.
Let's go back just a little less time. Let's move ahead a little bit and go to Titanic because that event, of course, was just world changing. The event itself was such a moment and it's captured the imagination and I think still continues to capture the imagination. Um but starting at about as I'm looking back at about 1958, the tellings of that start. And of course, you have to give it some time after the real event before you can start turning it into a story. But the big movie in 1997, that big blockbuster when they really went for it, and it costs about $200 million. You've got Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, and they just sort of went all out for it. So tell us about that movie because although it was a blockbuster, again, there was some controversy about it. So tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. Yes, it was a blockbuster, and the special effects were to die for. I mean, absolutely brilliant. But again, it's the characterization. It's the difficulty of getting modern audiences to equate with how it was in the past. Now, it's not that long ago, 1912, it's yesterday. But
Right.
even so, attitudes have changed, and recently they've changed very rapidly indeed. So the idea of um, a working class hero,
Mm-hmm.
DiCaprio, actually getting even to meet Kate Winslet, never mind develop a relationship with her, is unbelievable. It would not have happened. He might have been interested, but she wouldn't have been because he was so far below her in the social structure that she wouldn't have looked at him twice. That's what I didn't like about the movie. It was a slightly icky love story, and it was an unrealistic love story too. People complained, and I think quite rightly as well, that they exaggerated the class difference, having ignored the class difference between the pair of lovers. They ignored the class difference in terms of the steerage passengers literally being locked under the decks, which they were not,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the crew threatening to shoot them, which never happened, to the extent that the family of that crewman complained to James Cameron to say, hey, how dare you, basically, that is not true. And we know from the historical records that it wasn't true. There was nothing like it at
Mm-hmm.
all. So, as far as history goes, I'm afraid it was a chance wasted. In terms of an epic movie, tremendous, very good.
Right. And you talk about the special effects, which were wonderful and could have been used maybe to tell more of the real stories because there were several people that we know were there. I mean, again, it's recent enough that records are excellent. So we know who was there, we know who was lost, we know who was saved. And the fictional got in the way, I think, in some cases with Titanic. It was so focused on the love story. Again, you could have had a love story that was a little less, when Kate Winslet goes down to be with DiCaprio in his area, that just would not have happened.
Sure, sure. There used to be many years ago on British television an advert And don't ask me what it was for, I can't remember, but it was based on the Titanic. And there was this guy getting into the boats with the women. He's wearing this frock and this big hat. And then he takes it all off, and there he is with his moustache. And he's actually a man who has escaped, which I thought was a lovely touch. I hope that never happened, but it might have done.
It might have. You don't know. Well, and there are some historical records and different Titanic exhibitions and museums that really do tell the real story. And the real story is very compelling and the real people. So it was a missed opportunity to look at some of these real lives. There
Yes,
was Go ahead, go ahead.
I think it was. The problem is that with the historical record, you've usually got both sides, haven't you? You've got he
Mhm.
said, she said,
Mhm.
and that doesn't work for a movie. I think for a movie, you've got to take sides. You've
Yes.
got to be on the side of Winslet and DiCaprio.
Mhm.
Therefore, you can't have much time for the powers that be, for the snobby elements among the passengers, for the captain and the crew who seem heartless. That doesn't work in a movie. It's got to be very simple and straightforward.
Yes, and cinematic. And again, you do get caught up in the visuals. Once again, the visuals are just breathtaking and quite stunning. All right. Now we've talked, so that's a really big blockbuster. So we've talked about, sort of blockbuster movies, ways that stories like Elizabeth I, Mary Queen of Scots, a couple of times, Catherine of Aragon and Henry II. So these movies do become blockbusters, certainly Titanic. And we've talked a little bit about the small screen, like the Tudors. And you mentioned that that was something that was all over. And one of the sort of push and pull with the Tudors in particular is at the beginning, when you sit down to watch it, it begins with some sense that historically this is what really happened. I mean, they're using some visuals that are historic visuals and they're sort of implying this is what really happened. And then it's not. And one of the things, I mean, you mentioned one of the things that bothered you. One of the things that I just really would get so frustrated by in the Tudors, and there were many, but they combined Henry VIII's two sisters into one woman, and there was only one sister, and you just can't tell the story that way. So there are things. Um, but I want to mention a more recent, because these television versions are, the Tudors is not that long ago, but more recently, and in fact ongoing, is The Crown. And that has specifically raised the question of, do these, and I don't know, the names change, but they may be called docudramas now. So it's
Yeah.
part documentary because it's about real people, but it's a drama. It's not a documentary. And, our understanding of history changes certainly. And a documentary filmed 50 years ago might not look like a documentary today without all of the movie elements, just because history changes and our understanding changes and we discover new things. And that's certainly very true. But The Crown is dealing with people who are still alive today. And so there are other
Mhm,
issues
mhm,
involved. Tell
mhm.
us a little bit about how that kind of show um, causes some controversy, the kinds of questions you might bring to it. Help us understand the influence of that.
Yeah, it's a good one, the Crown, for you to bring up, because it does cause controversy. You're quite right, and I think an awful lot of people believe it to be true because it's on the screen. And that's very naive, but I'm afraid it's how it goes. Just like as a kid, I thought that everything Charlton Heston did as El Cid, he really did. Yeah, he was there on his horse, he was dead, and he still won a battle. It would be great if that happened. But
Yeah.
and similarly with the Crown, we have no idea um, what was said behind closed doors. We have no idea what Charles and Diana actually talked about when they were alone. We have no idea what the Queen said to anybody. In fact, until recently, it wasn't actually acceptable to say what the Queen had said. When an actor or an actress meets the Queen, she would usually say, "Hello, have you come far?" or something like that. But the actor or actress wasn't allowed to say what the Queen had said. So there was no law against it, but it was accepted. It was the norm that you don't report what royalty talk about. Suddenly, with the Crown, we know in inverted commas what they talk about and to whom and when and how, and it's fiction. It has to be fiction. And of course, the makers of that series were very clever because they knew very well the royals would do nothing about it. There would be no action taken, there'd be no litigation, because famously the royal family in Britain never complain and never explain. So they were on safe ground.
Right. But people do think it's true in some cases, right?
Yeah, they do. They do. Absolutely, they do. The royal family are a peculiar lot in many ways. I don't mean as people, but we see them through a rarefied atmosphere. They're always surrounded by security, as all
Mhm.
heads of state are. They're distant figures. My wife and I were talking earlier today about examples we know where we know people who have met various members of the royals, and they all say the same thing. They're perfectly nice people face to face, but you never see them like that. I have met Princess Anne. My wife has met the late Queen. I had a friend who was at college with the King, as he is now, and just occasionally you have glimpses of reality, but most people never see that. And so they are perfectly prepared to believe everything the Crown tells them, just as they believed everything that Charles and Heston told them as El Cid,
Yes.
and Catherine Hepburn told them as
Yes.
Eleanor of Aquitaine. It's the same thing, you know.
Right. And it's just interesting because when it's people who are still alive, it does take on a little bit different tone or different impact. And I know many years ago, I believe with the encouragement of the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, there was a bit of a documentary, sort of inside the palace where cameras were invited in and filmed the royal family just like us, getting in the car, getting the kids out of the car, laughing, joking, and it was, screened once and the queen said never again. And so, there's a desire, and perhaps there's less desire with subsequent generations, but certainly the late queen wanted the distance. And um it's just very interesting to see. You're right. If we're going to believe what Eleanor of Aquitaine or Charlton Heston presents as the real version of history, we're sort of programmed to believe what the crown says. And their characters have aged, so we can see that. We can see them actually as entirely different people, which is a little disconcerting to me when they changed so much. But in any case, all right. So, having talked about different times in history and all of this, as you worked on this book, thought about your own experiences as a child and sort of encountering history, falling in love with history this way, um, what is your overall, or what are some of your sort of overall thoughts about the impact of these Hollywood or TV versions of history? And how can we, as viewers of that, because we're all going to go see those great movies and watch these TV, how can we get the most out of it? And we want to enjoy them as well. We don't want them all to be documentaries, right? It's a different goal. And actually, how can we still enjoy and, be interested in history as well? So what's your overall kind of assessment of that?
I I think really you've got to be quite cynical about the whole thing. You can go and watch an historical movie and be completely caught up in the drama, as with Titanic, as with Braveheart. I mean, I'm a Welshman, but I came out of that cinema watching Braveheart feeling like a Scotsman, great, marvelous, hey. Then you think about it for a while, and reality kicks in. And because of my historical background, and I've done the work, I know that much of it was fiction, and I appreciate that most of the public won't know that. But I think you've got to be cynical. You've got to be rational, and you've got to just think to yourself, I wonder if it really happened like that. And hopefully then you'll go away and find a book, or look up online and see what we think really happened. And I stress that we think, because of
Right.
course we don't know in a lot of
Yes.
cases. It may
Yes.
be that the makers of movies get it more right than we know, and more right than historians do. Historians are incredibly fallible people. They make mistakes all the time. I make mistakes all the time. It's bound to happen. You've got evidence about the past, be it archaeology or the
Hmm.
written word or film, whatever. But you've got to interpret that. You've got to say,
Hmm.
what does this tell me? What does this mean? And I don't know whether what we think is true, correct, is actually any more true or correct than what Cecil B. DeMille told us all those years ago. Yeah?
Right. Right. So it is good, enjoy, feel free to enjoy, but ask the questions. And I think if we bring a curiosity to our experiences, as we're sitting and watching Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots have lunch out in the woods, or as we're watching whatever it is, we can just get curious about finding out as much as we can. There are things we know, there are records we can turn to. There are a lot of good sources to learn a little more. And I think that's what we hope. You read a book, you read two historic books, they might not say the same thing. So you start asking more questions. I think we need to not be afraid to ask questions. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much. I think this has been a wonderful way of thinking about history. It's all interpretation. And some people have a really big budget and famous stars to use for their interpretation. We just have to be aware they're trying to sell tickets, not always tell the whole story. But we can certainly enjoy those sweeping scenes and the beautiful cinematography, and just, let that inspire you to ask some questions and keep learning. And so I think that's one of the things we can take away. Well, thank you so much. So your book is available. People can get it now. Is that right?
Yep, they can indeed. Yep, yep. It's called History versus Hollywood,
Yes.
and it's published by Pen and Sword, UK publisher Pen and Sword, but it's available in the States as well.
Yes, it is. And I will have links for that in the show notes so you can easily get it. It is a great read. And this was a great discussion. Thank you so much, MJ Trow, for spending some time with us, chatting about a different way of seeing history and different questions we can continue to ask. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for joining us again on Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I hope you'll take an opportunity to maybe share this episode with a history loving and movie loving friend. I really appreciate your joining me on this journey. Big shout out of appreciation, as always, to my wonderful, wonderful patrons. And I hope we can all enjoy ourselves as we keep shaking up history together. Thank you.